Welcome to another episode of the Disciple Standard Podcast. We're glad you're here. My name's Scott. We've got a great show for you. Today on the show, we're going to talk about something important, church metrics. We're going to get into how do we track and quantify how our church is doing. So church metrics. We're going to spend some time telling you our church metrics. How are we growing? What are the numbers? And then we have a fantastic, in fact, really good interview with the director of the Center for Church Renewal, Keith Doornbos. Is a great episode. Thanks for joining us. Let's get started. All right, everyone, welcome to the Disciple Standard Podcast today. And as the topic for today, I want to talk about church metrics, which I think is an important and an exciting topic. And I just want to spend some time talking about this because I think that this is something that's so important. In many places, these will be called KPIs, key performance indicators. It's a way of measuring whether you're achieving your objectives and whether, as a church, we're doing what we hope to be doing. Now, I think what I'm going to try to do is just talk about in modern times what metrics have been used for church and how those metrics have been used. And listen, the key question with regard to church metrics is how are you going to know if you're accomplishing your mission? So the point isn't the numbers, it's the mission that the numbers are measuring. So I want to just have that as a disclaimer. The numbers only indicate or give some measurement to what it is that you're hoping to accomplish in your mission. So the key things about the mission and the numbers are then meant to be an indication. And actually, in church life, this is one of the areas where people have been searching for, all right, what's the proper measurement tool? How will we know if we're accomplishing our mission? So I'm going to, Jake, kind of give like a historical overview of how churches, I think, have gone about measuring whether they're being successful or not in their mission, whether they're achieving what they hope to achieve. And so this first set of ideas I call the 1.0 version. They are the simple metrics that have always been there underneath, and churches have measured themselves this way. And you can say, you'll throw it on the screen for me, Jake. There's a picture of a church pew and a dollar. Probably the two biggest metrics that people have always used: butts in seats, dollars in plates. And churches have felt that, okay, if there are an increasing number of butts in seats, and if there's more and more dollars in plates, then it must be that our church is succeeding. We must, it must be that we're on mission and things are going well here. And often, there's almost like the just look and feel of it. Yeah, if the church is getting bigger, if the budget's growing, then it must be, wow, that's a successful church. I don't know, Jake, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's easy to get caught up in numbers like that.
Okay,
just because
why?
They're like quantifiable, like you could see them.
Okay.
And a lot of the time, people might be there being dragged along. That's how I came to church.
Okay, right.
I wouldn't say I'm an active member at that point.
So there's something about this. I mean, when we talk about these metrics, eventually I'm hoping to get to some better metrics than the simple one, butts and seats, dollars and plates. I think there's better things to measure, but there is something about this that, you can't deny. It's the most obvious. It's the easiest to see. I can remember, this probably goes back years ago. It was very common in churches, and there are probably still churches that this is very common still today. They have a printed bulletin. That's almost a pre-COVID phenomenon, this printed bulletin. And in the printed bulletin, week by week, there'd be somebody who'd be counting how many people were there. And so you'd have an attendance number. And then you'd have a giving number. So people could also look and see what was given last week and maybe track that against the year. And it was like a very quick way to take the temperature. How's our church doing? What were those two numbers, butts and seats, dollars and plates? And I can even say this, it's been 20 years now I've been in ministry. I can think, for most of my ministry, there's almost a way in which as pastors talk to each other, it's like, you got one pastor, well, my congregation's 200 people and our budget's about, $200,000. And another pastor, well, we're about 500 and we've got about a $700,000 budget. And it's sort of like, oh, well, then you must be doing better. You must be a better pastor. You must have a better church. And if you were a church of, let's say, 60 people with a $100,000 a year budget, then you see how this works. I think there's something meaningful in these numbers, and then there's something not meaningful at all. I mean, are people growing there? Are people spiritually alive? Is this church accomplishing the Great Commission? That's why I call it the 1.0 metrics. They're there, they're undeniable, they're the easiest to see, to touch, to feel, but what do we really learn from them? I mean, there are ministries that fill stadiums that, boy, if it's Christianity, it's hard to recognize, and people are there, but just because there's dollars flowing in and there's lots of people present, that doesn't mean that, wow, this is a God-honoring, faithful church. So it's an important measurement, but it doesn't give the whole story. So anyway, I have, maybe what I'll call we have the 1.0 version. Now this is like a slight upgrade to 1.1 version. And so instead of just tracking attendance, how many people, you'll do something a little qualitative. You'll say, well, what about next generation attendance? Is this church just filled with the previous generation? Or are we reaching the next or younger generation? And so how many young people happen to be in attendance? How many children happen to be in attendance? Because that tells you something about the vitality of the mission. It's just a repository for people to come who already like Christianity, but there's no impact on the culture. Or are we bringing in some new people? Also, instead of just pure dollars given, there are churches who, they made an upgrade. They started counting giving units. How many families were giving? Is that growing? Or, because you could just have almost no one who's giving their life away, but you have one person who is just causing one or two families causing the budget to sway one way or the next. And so anyway, I think some churches, they took this 1.0 version, they gave a little upgrade, and they're measuring some other things underneath those two big headings. So if I'm thinking about kind of the history of church metrics, I'm calling that the 1.0 version. Now, Jake, we'll move on to the 2.0 version. There are some churches that said, okay, this just isn't sufficient. The butts in chairs, dollars in plates. And they started measuring things like this. How many salvations or baptisms can we record this year? This was better because, if it's just, I got a 500-person church, it's been a 500-person church, there's nobody coming to Christ, there's no one whose lives being changed, then, maybe my church needs some improvement, or there's something else that I need to measure. And so I think that people started, at least this is a measurement against the Great Commission. Are we reaching people for Christ? Are people's lives being changed? And then a couple other metrics, like how many people are participating in the various programs we offer. So small group participation. How much of our church, what percentage of our church is involved in programs beyond Sunday morning? So whether that's in Bible studies or community groups or fellowship activities, we began measuring as churches, the engagement, the participation. And another one, how many people are actively volunteering? In other words, not just coming as a consumer to take things, but we're actually involved in volunteering and giving, whether it's in the church or outside of the church. So churches started measuring to just kind of take the spiritual temperature of the people that are there. Some of these things, salvations and baptisms, programming and participation, and volunteers. Then there's what I call the 3.0. So we're upgrading, right? Just like a computer operating system from 1.0 to 1.1, now 2.0, now 3.0 operating system. I'll call this qualitative analysis. And there's so many church consulting firms that, help churches with regard to qualitative analysis. So these are church surveys, as an example, that, year by year track, maybe we'll call it church satisfaction. So there'll be a survey, it goes out to every member, and we'll find out, how satisfied are people with the music, with the preaching? Is this church sufficiently friendly and hospitable? Do people feel cared for? How is the church engaged in the community? What kind of program is being offered? Is that appreciated? What's the socioeconomics of the members? I mean, does the socioeconomics of the members match the socioeconomics of the community? What are the facilities like? Beyond just how many people are there and how many dollars in the plate, these kinds of surveys begin to, give the church some feedback as to the type of offerings it has and how it's doing. And there are lots of churches who started to measure these kinds of things, and churches who also made attempts to measure spiritual growth. So how many people report praying every day? How many people report reading the Bible every day? How well do people know the Bible? How committed do they report being to Jesus? And, I can think as an example, the Willow Network put out the Reveal survey, and they attempted to figure out how do we track and measure spiritual growth, and what are the indicators that move people along that continuum of spiritual growth. This is the kind of qualitative analysis, things that we can measure. Another type of qualitative analysis is the breakout of budget expenditures. So it's one thing to just say, okay, this year we took in this many dollars, but then now how were those dollars spent? Were they all spent on our own facilities and our own staffing and our own comforts? How much is spent on outside missions and reaching people for Christ? People would make these pie charts, and they take a look at the pie charts to try to figure out what would a healthy church look like, or how can we become a better church by, looking at the breakout of our budget expenditures. Another type of qualitative analysis that's been done in the church world, I call this like the 3.0 version, has to do with leadership. How strong is the leadership? Is there a articulated vision and mission? Strategy? Are the leaders active in planning? How well do they execute what they plan? Do they make these statements and just put them in a file cabinet somewhere, or do they have a real life impact? And is there execution on the planning that's done? And then finally, community engagement. I can especially think in the last 20 years, people would ask this question: if all of a sudden your church just disappeared from your community, how many people would notice? And so as part of the qualitative analysis, they'd even, different consulting firms or even churches themselves would go and interview people in the community who aren't even a part of this church. Hey, how is this church impacting the community? And they'd get some metrics and feedback about that, and then try to, year by year, make improvement. Anyway, you can see that this is becoming a lot more complicated, right, Jake? I don't know if you have any thoughts with regard to this. We've sort of moved from things that are right in front of our face that we can't miss. How many people? Yeah. What's the budget like? Through, maybe some better metrics that get at the Great Commission. Are we reaching people for Christ? Are we having baptisms? Now to all kinds of qualitative analysis about the programming we offer, how people are growing, what the budget's like, how effective the leadership is, how much are we reaching the community, and trying to track these stats.
Yeah, I love how you titled it, where it says like qualitative analysis rather than quantitative, like something like you said, like easily you can see it, you count it, because I think that's more meaningful in the long run, and I think it even grows from there. I know you have a bunch of stuff planned. It just grows past what you could see and more of what you mean rather than.
Yeah, so things. That's why I'm kind of 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. This is clearly better than just how many people, how many dollars. Okay, but now we're going to talk about the 4.0 analysis. And this, I just, in the last 20, 30 years, I think you can track this. All of a sudden, churches and pastors became much more concerned with these things. I call these metrics for a digital age. So churches started tracking how many email subscribers do we have? What are our web page stats? How many people come and visit our site? How many hits do we have? How optimized is our site for search engines? And then you had the social media phenomenon. And so now churches began to be concerned with social media engagement, likes, follows. How many followers do we have for our page? And there's a way in which, this has just happened in culture. If you don't exist online, then you really don't exist in reality, which I think is just an amazing feature of our current culture, but it's so true. I mean, even if you want to go to a restaurant or to a movie, you first check online and then you go there in real life. So churches became aware of this and started tracking these things. How many views do our videos or posts have? That became very important metric. And now churches, as they're coming out with their own apps, now are concerned about app downloads. How many people have downloaded the app? What kind of engagement does the app have? So these are now metrics for a digital age. And I'd say, Jake, actually, a lot of your work in media here at our church, Sunlight, has dealt with these kinds of things and these kinds of metrics. These are the things I know you're paying attention to.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I ran the Instagram and the Facebook and stuff like that, and just watching and learning how different. There's so many different ways to gauge your engagement.
That's true.
And the likes and the follows, the shares, and all that. Just figuring out ways. It's like a fun game to play.
Well, sure. And what's great about this too is it's so easily quantifiable. Mm-hmm. When you put out a post, you can know exactly how many people saw that post, how many people engaged with that post. And so there's a way in which you can, in a real way, start to sense whether you're making traction or falling back, whether you're relevant or irrelevant. And now the 5.0 version of things. The 5.0 version, I call this version now metrics for a phygital age. And I know for many of us, as we're listening in, you may not be even familiar with the term phygital. It's a combination of the word physical and digital. And I think what people are recognizing is that this mixture of online and digital and real life engagement, it's not always easy to see where the line is. They're often so together that it's difficult to see. And especially now in times of COVID, where all of a sudden it wasn't possible all the time to be physically present because of quarantines and the like. And now all of a sudden churches have had to start measuring other things, and they realize okay, just how many people are viewing a video, or how many likes, or how big's our email list. That's not necessarily the only thing. And so now churches are starting to measure things like this: the number of first-time connections you make as a result of your digital posts. So in other words, you have these digital posts and then someone actually contacts you, and now you're talking to a real person where you've converted someone from, maybe remotely online in another state even, to a contact that you have, whether that's an email address or a telephone number or a conversation. Someone's watched something or read something, and now they've contacted you for the first time, or you've made contact with them, and people are measuring how often does that happen. Or the number of people taking a first step. This would be how many people, as a result of that online content, actually walk through the doors of the church for the first time, or how many people who walked through the doors as a result of that online connection now joined another ministry or maybe a new members class. Other metrics for phygital age, now the average duration of online views. Are people just watching for 3 seconds? Are they watching for 10 seconds? Are they watching the entire video? Because there could be lots and lots of people who click on, they immediately realize, I don't want to watch this, and they click off. And, it's not helpful to know that someone interacted with it if it wasn't relevant to their lives. And then also engagement with online views. So not only did they watch it, but then they commented or they got in a conversation. And churches are now tracking how many of these engagements are we having. And so anyway, Jake, here I've just sort of traced, and I think this has all happened in a relatively short amount of time, that churches have moved in their church metrics from the simple butts in seats, dollars in plates, through maybe a more sophisticated version of that, to something that's more in touch with how are we doing reaching people for Christ in the Great Commission, to some qualitative analysis that gives us more feedback about how things are really going kind of behind the scenes, to now this digital and phygital. You can see that we've become much more sophisticated as we've gone along. And, for those who have a mission and they want to track how they're doing against the mission, there's all kinds of metrics that are available to people.
Yeah, no, I know for me, even just when I started coming here to Sunlight, we were still passing out bulletins and stuff like that. And it was cool to see because I got to print them and see, at the end of the day, how many we got to now, helping run the media, everything. And then I like seeing that tracked through my time here. I've learned a lot from it. And I know it's definitely changed the course of how we do certain things.
Yes, getting feedback and having metrics is just so important. But now I actually, this show is about upgrading the operating system of the church. And when I talk about upgrading the operating system of the church, I talk about what is necessary, what the new operating system is. But I also at the same time call it the ancient operating system. And I think actually I'm going to call this the 0.0 version, because I think there's something underneath all of this that is important to track that churches have not been tracking. I think that what I'm about to talk about, it's way more important metrics. And yet it's not like, we've gone from digital to phygital to this next thing. Like, it's not, in many ways, you're going to say, well, that's not as sophisticated as I thought. And yet I call it like the metrics underneath the metrics that make all the other metrics worthwhile. And so I call this the 0.0. In fact, I think they're the ancient metrics. And I think they've got to become the new metrics for the church. So beyond, just who's in the pew and how many dollars in the plate, these are the types of things that I'm advocating for and that the show is advocating for. So here's the question: how many disciples? It's one thing to have a whole bunch of people show up and they're attending. Okay, so they're in attendance. But how many of them are going through a process where they are maturing as Christians? And as they're maturing as Christians, they are becoming reproducing Christians as well. We've got this phrase, disciples make disciples. They really are being taught, the fundamentals of the faith. They're able to teach them to others. How many disciples are there? Not just congregants or participants or attenders or even church members, but how many are truly disciples of Jesus Christ? Second, how many can articulate the gospel? I can tell you that this is a very important question from my standpoint, and I was a pastor for a long time when I finally asked myself, okay, I'm preaching sermons week after week after week after week, but if I go around to the people who are in my church and I say, hey, listen, can you do me a favor? Just articulate the gospel for me. Or tell me, what's the main message of Christianity? Or what's Christianity about? How many people could articulate the gospel? And by the way, I dare you, if you're a church leader, to do this with your people. Just go around and start asking people, can you do me a favor? Just tell me, from your standpoint, by your experience, what's the main message of Christianity? When I first did this, it was so eye-opening to me because I realized, boy, someone can attend and be a butt in the seat, and they're not able, when called upon, to articulate the main message of the Bible, the gospel, which means that, with their friends or their family members or the people they know, if ever called upon, they are not going to be able in a convincing way to help them know about Jesus, to know the gospel. And if you can't articulate it, there's just no ability for us to pursue our mission. So this is an important question. How many people who are in attendance, if you pulled them aside and, hey, can you do me a favor? Can you articulate the gospel? They're able to do it. Now, even more important, how many people in a particular church are disciple makers? So these aren't those who are just coming and receiving somehow. They're participating in sermons, or they're actually able to take another person and they're able to lead them from beginning to end, what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and not only teach them what it means to be a follower of Jesus so that they know Jesus, but then teach them how to become a disciple maker themselves. And so how many people are engaged in that in your congregation? That is an important number to track. And then even this, how many multipliers? So we talk about this, right? How many people they've made a disciple who made a disciple? How many people in your congregation have made a disciple who made a disciple? That's an important number to track. And then here's another one. How many people have made disciples who have made disciples who have made disciples so that there's 10 in their network? How many people have made disciples who have made disciples who have made disciples who have made disciples so that there's 30 in just their person's network? How many are in the 60s? How many in the hundreds? And I would suggest that today a church can measure this. How many people do we have in this church who have a network of 10? How many people do we have in this church who have a network of 30? How many 60? How many 100? And I'll tell you what, these metrics that I'm talking about, they take care of all the other metrics. You will see that all the other the more sophisticated metrics get taken care of when you get right back to the Great Commission. And you know that you're teaching people the gospel, and they're coming to know Jesus, and they're making disciples, and they're multiplying 30, 60, 100 times over. The more people you have in your church who are doing this, now the kingdom's really growing. And so when it comes to church metrics, all these other metrics that we talked about, they're important, they're interesting, they can help measure things, they're needed today. But I'm advocating for, you could call it the next step, but I call it the step before all the steps, which is really about disciples and disciple making. So anyway, Jake, that is, and for all who are listening, kind of the topic for today. I wonder, what your thoughts are about this. I'd love to hear your feedback. Is this helpful? If you have any questions about how to measure these things, we'll be glad to help you out. At any rate, this is a perfect place to make a turn in the show, because this show talks about our metrics every single week. We're moving to the second part of our show called The Tipping Point. All right, so this week we've got 8 new disciples, and we just keep on growing week by week. If you're tuning in, you can see this really is a multiplying movement. Just the number of people who are included in what we're doing just continues to grow. I'm just so glad about that. I think it's so encouraging. Everybody who's involved, keep it up. Let me take some time just to acknowledge some who are new. I want to welcome Cassie Newcomb, Noah Zettler, and Terry Wallace, all of whom are being discipled by Josh Zettler, which, Jake, this is great because Josh was your disciple, and I think that's really neat. Josh, great job. Thank you for what you're doing in discipling people. Also want to welcome Daniel Castillo, who's being discipled by Diego Granada. I want to welcome Trinity Nazario, who's being discipled by Sarah Jesus, Sam Seitz, who's being discipled by Adam Dreffs. Want to welcome Greg Howenstein, who's being discipled by me. I took on a new disciple myself this week. Welcome to Greg. And then also Rachel Wirtz, who's being discipled by Laura Posthumus. Welcome each and every one. So now this is what's really exciting. We get to celebrate a couple of first-time disciple makers, which is a big deal because you move from being a receiver to now a giver. You've been discipled, now you're becoming a disciple maker. So want to just say congratulations to Diego Granada and Adam Dreffs. Really happy that you've made that move. It's a big deal, and just wish you God's blessings as you begin to disciple people. Also, and this is another big deal, I want to celebrate a first-time multiplier. Now, a multiplier happens when you're discipling someone. So you are discipling someone, and that someone starts to disciple someone. You've taught them to take on a disciple. You've become a multiplier. Your efforts are being multiplied. I think that's excellent. And so to Tim Koyman, just great job. Really proud of what you're doing. Thankful for how God's using you, and wish that God will just, continue to multiply your efforts. Now, here's another thing, another big deal, the 10 milestone, which means, you've got a series of disciples and you've got a series of descendants, and the total of those disciples and descendants is 10. These are 10 lives that because you've now given yourself away, their lives are ultimately changed. And so I want to congratulate Josh Zettler and Jake Motese. Jake, great job. John Granada, Kurt Walters, and Laura Koning, all of them are now reaching the 10 milestone. They're all experiencing multiplication in their disciple making. I'm just so happy to see this happening in our movement. We're also celebrating two people who have reached the 30 milestone, Juan Sierra and Trisha Bosma. This is excellent. These are two people who now, because they've taken the effort to give themselves away, to be discipling people who are discipling people who are discipling people, there are 30 lives who have been transformed, changed by the gospel that God's power is now working in. And it's a really big deal. So to Juan and to Trisha, great job. The total number of disciples in our network is now 612. This just keeps growing all the time. I'm excited about that. So great job. All right, and now here, we're going to move on to the third segment of our show as we interview Keith Doornbos. All right, everyone, I'm joined today by Keith Doornbos. Keith is a good friend of mine. He is the executive director of the Center for Church Renewal, someone that I really have come to appreciate, love, respect. Keith, thanks for joining us today. Let me just start this way. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what is the Center for Church Renewal?
Oh, thank you, Scott. It's great to be with you. The Center for Church Renewal is an organization that's about 10 years old, a decade or so, that has a commitment to come alongside leaders who are renewing churches. Our larger goal is that we will help to develop through these leaders intentional missional congregations that'll make more and better disciples who transform lives and communities for Christ. And we do that through a variety of means, through cohorts of churches that are walking through a process of listen and then imagine and then do. We have coaching, we have a doctorate of ministries program. We have a number of ways we're doing assessments of churches for how they're doing, even helping churches when they come to a crossroads to try to figure out what to do next when they've run out of gas in their ministry tank. So we do a number of things in our attempt to serve these leaders who are renewing churches.
Yeah, that's great. And I think obviously church renewal is one of the most important issues that churches are facing today. Keith is a great person to get in touch with, the Center for Church Renewal. I think you've got your finger on the pulse of what's happening, which is why I'm excited to talk to you. So
well, thank you.
The big topic that I'd like to bring up, of course, COVID has all of a sudden just changed the game, I think, in so many church settings. And like I said, you have your finger on the pulse with a lot of pastors, a lot of leaders, a lot of churches. And I'd like to just ask, what are you seeing? What are the trends?
Well, there are a number of trends, and they've been challenging for churches. One of the trends is just the in-person attendance. The average church today, by statistics from Gallup and Lifeway and other organizations, and just from my observation and conversation with churches, is that the average church has 30 to 50% fewer persons worshiping in person than they did prior to the pandemic. Now that's an average. There are some churches that have been hit even harder, and they are just plain out of gas, and they're kind of pulling their vehicles, their ministry vehicles, alongside the road and just saying we can't go any further, and they're calling it a day. Other churches actually are flourishing. I have a couple of churches, one that I'm working with right now that had two worship services prior to the pandemic, and today has 4 worship services and are looking to add a 5th. And so it's not entirely true of all churches, but there are some that are doing worse and some are better, these flourishing few on the one end. So that's kind of a trend. And that matches up. Barna research found that 48% of churchgoers recently that they did interviews with aren't doing anything with their church attendance. Not even, by the way, coming online and listening online. And so that's a pretty key statistic. There's another organization called Glue, and they indicated that 25% of people who had been regular church attenders presently are not attending and have no idea when they'll return. So you can see that there's sort of those statistics that support this issue. And more persons who are looking at these trends are saying, listen, we just need to come to reality. We have to tell ourselves the truth that there's a number of people who just are never going to come back. I mean, if Joe and Sarah and their 3 kids used to come every week, and now they come once a month, but they tend to listen online, maybe after the COVID completes and we get to a new normal, they may return. But if Joe and Sarah, you haven't seen them for the last year and a half, maybe just once during the summer, an outdoor service or so, they're likely not coming back. So we're going to have to really adjust ourselves to sort of this new normal. But there's a bigger thing that's going on, Scott, that I think I just would like to name, and that's that much of this isn't about COVID at all. It's about the culture. And just a noting about this cultural shift, Pew Research did a major research project in 2007 and found that 78% of Americans identified as Christian. And they did that same survey in 2021, just recently, and found out that that number had dropped to 63%, from 78% to 63%, a 15% drop. Now, in our nation of 330 million, that represents a 50 million person decline in those who identify as Jesus followers. Now, I just want to give you a picture of what that's like. I live up in Michigan, in snowy Michigan.
Yeah.
And if in 2007, every person who lived in the states of Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin, this kind of around the Lake Michigan loop, the Great Lakes kind of thing, if every person in 2007 had been a believer, this would look like every person living in those states of Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin no longer were a believer and no longer attended church. And every church in all those states would be completely closed, and there would be a for sale sign in the front side. And that's what would happen if all of what has happened in the U.S. had happened just in those states. So we are really seeing a significant decline. And we're seeing that then in church attendance.
That's staggering. I mean, if I just think about what you just said, in fact, a lot of people right now, they could maybe comfort themselves and say, well, this is COVID, and as soon as COVID's over. But what you've just said is that there's this large trend of decline, and maybe COVID's even accelerated that trend of decline. And that decline is not small, it's very profound. So I guess anyone listening in, there has, in this moment, and if you didn't catch everything he said, just, you can, this is a good thing about the internet, just wind that back up, listen to it again. It's like there's got to be a wake-up call. We cannot just continue doing things the way we did them before. It's not like, oh, let's just return back to normal or go back because everything was fine. Everything wasn't fine. And so we've got to, and this is, I think, what the Center for Church Renewal is all about, we've got to find some real deep, abiding, lasting, true renewal, because even pre-COVID, there were big cracks in the foundation. Things were not going well in Christianity in the United States anyway. Yeah,
that's true. That's so true. And it's interesting that that's bearing itself out in terms of Americans' membership in houses of worship. And this includes churches and synagogues and mosques, but preeminently in the United States, of course, churches. And for the first time in 80 years of polling and research, Gallup found that less than 50%, so 46% to be exact, no, 47% to be exact, of Americans have an identification with a house of worship. And in 2000, which isn't long ago, most of us can remember 2000, that number was 70%.
Wow.
So that is a mega decline in terms of church membership. So there is this huge trend. And now, for us, the win, of course, isn't that we have people in church, although we would love to have people in church. But the real thing is that church attendance is affiliated with the means of grace. It's where people hear the gospel preached. It's where the sacraments are celebrated, the gospel is celebrated. It's where people are discipled into a deeper life in Christ. And so it's really, all of this is not about being members of church. It's about being members of the body of Christ and its affiliation. So we really need to, the Center for Church Renewal is saying the church is the hope of the world. All right. The local church is the hope of the world. And the local church presents these opportunities for people to mature and grow. And therefore, we need to have churches thrive. And we're saddened when they don't, and we're encouraged when they do.
So I have, I guess, this impulse or intuition that a lot of people who will be listening to this, the statistics are only going to substantiate what they're already experiencing. So, there's a way in which if you're part of a church, especially if you're a church leader in any capacity whatsoever, it's not like you're going to be watching this and all of a sudden you got new information. You're just now going to, you've quantified that information for us. What's the underlying causes? Do you have any sense of what are the underlying causes? And then maybe even transition to, if you can identify what are some of the underlying causes, what are some opportunities that are now in front of us, or what's, is there a way forward?
Well, the causes are complex, right? I mean, when we get into this, but the major cause is that the culture is shifting, right? We're moving towards a post-churched culture, and in that post-church and even a post-faith culture, these cultural trends that are set out by all the things that happen that shift culture, right? It's all the way that the media communicates. It's the way that we do life together and so on. All of it is kind of a mega cultural shift, and those cultural forces create a current that people get caught in, and this current that's against, if you will, sort of the traditional faith and the traditional places where faith is being experienced, houses of worship, is strong and is growing. We see it every time we, flip on the news or we watch maybe television or so on. So it's a cultural thing. Now, against that culture, the problem is that the church used to have that culture kind of flowing in their direction. So that was helpful, right? It didn't take much to survive when the cultural winds or the currents were with you. When they're against you, then you need to be able to swim. And when the culture trends are light, current is light, or winds are light, you don't have to swim well. You just have to swim okay, right? But today, to swim against those currents is you need to be an Olympic swimmer, and even then it's very difficult. And the problem is that we have not discipled people with enough depth to handle the currents. And that is becoming a very alarming and difficult situation. So it's really a cultural shift more than anything else, and it's a lack of maturity and capacity to disciple people in the midst of it that has really upended us. So you asked the question, well, what's the solution?
Yeah, what are the opportunities? What's the solution? Is there, is this just we're wiping states off the map as we go, or?
Well, okay, some of it is that we're going to have to just embrace that we're no longer going to be the majority voice in our culture, right? And so we're going to just have to welcome and accept the fact that we're going to be a minority voice, if you
Okay.
will. But having said that, Christianity has always thrived as a minority voice, right?
Right.
It tends to do worse when it actually is the majority culture. And so we look at the first century churches where they really thrived. They were really the minority culture, right? They were speaking as a voice against the culture that was, so bankrupt, right? In the third world, Christianity is flourishing, but they're a minority culture.
Okay.
And so for us to be able to say, listen, we're moving towards minority culture, and that's okay, but we now have to learn how to live as a minority culture in which we are living distinct lives to really become the salt and light communities that we were intended always to be. And so we have to disciple better. We have to be better proclaimers of the gospel. And most importantly, we have to live the gospel in ways that really are compelling, right? So that we become those kind of people that other people say, I don't know what you have, but I want what you got. Please tell me about this, right? And I'm not sure that we have lived our lives and lived in culture in that kind of way. And so we have to disciple people into that kind of life of being a minority voice, but a compelling minority voice that calls people into that. So that's one thing that I would just say in the broadest sort of sense, right?
Yeah.
More specifically, I guess I would have a conversation about if you want to figure out what you can do, sort of as a congregation or whatever, that would sort of buck the currents, would swim against them, would be able to do well in the midst of them. Then I often look to churches that are flourishing in the culture and saying, what's true about you that helps you to flourish, right?
Right. And again, you have your pulse on these things. And so as you notice churches that even in the midst of these times, they're finding their steam, they're starting to flourish. What do you notice about them? What are the things that you see? And, what can we learn?
Yeah, sure. So I am working with some of these flourishing congregations as well as churches that are struggling. And let me just give to you a real quick list of 5 or 6 things that I think are true of them, right? So here goes. The first thing is that almost every one of these flourishing churches are gospel focused and discipleship driven. They really are passionate about the gospel.
Yeah.
They believe the gospel. They don't just sort of acknowledge and give a head nod to it. They really believe the gospel of Jesus Christ, that there is salvation that is available for all people who put their faith and trust in Jesus Christ, and that this gospel transforms a life. And then they go about discipling people into the life of Christ. They do it intentionally and on purpose. It isn't, the sort of the second tier thing they do. It's a first tier thing they do. So I'd say that's the first thing, right? The second thing is that these churches have learned the heart language of the culture. They address real life challenges of everyday folk. People feel that when they come to church that somebody is speaking and preaching into their journey, their life, their challenges. Lifeway research found that 57% of Americans, at least on a monthly basis, think about deeply how to add more purpose and meaning to their life. So people are always seeking, right? And these churches know how to speak into a seeking
these
heart.
are churches that have a love for the people around them because they care about people's concerns. And
that's exactly right.
Somehow want to serve them, love them.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And then the third thing is they harness technology as a ministry's front door. They realize that we're living in a new world that's been largely introduced through COVID, and that people are going to be reached often first through technology, and they know how to leverage that. Interestingly, 45% of Americans have viewed worship online since the pandemic, and 15% of those people are not churchgoers. So there's a number of people.
What an opportunity. So that's great.
That's right. That's great, right? Here's the next thing that's true of them. They've created a people movement. through the excitement of the gospel being spoken, the disciples being made, and ministries that are being had, and they have become ministries where friends invite friends, right? It's a people movement. And there's just sort of this momentum that's been created out of the things that we mentioned earlier. And the next thing that's true is they're flexible in adjusting to practices that meet the current realities and challenges. They realize that it is a new day that demands new ways. New days demand new ways, and they're capable of being flexible. They're creative, they're imaginative, and they can often change on a dime. They can adjust to the situations that are in front of them. And so this imaginative, creative core that's part of these churches is really essential, right? And then the next thing that I think is really true is that they persistently keep hope alive. They are optimistic to the core, right? Like we were just talking about majority-minority culture, and that going like, yes, we get to be the minority culture. Okay. Yes, we're going to be the salt and light. Yes, we're going to go out there and get this thing done. All right. So it's just that sort of attitude that they really have.
Okay, I love that. And by the way, I think I should just mention this. That list of 6 things, it just reminds me, every week you send out an email to those who subscribe. And I mean, each week I get a list like this of things to think about. And so if you're out there, you're listening to this, I encourage you to visit churchrenew.org, get connected with the Center for Church Renewal. You can get on the mailing list. And just encourage you to connect with Keith and the Center for Church Renewal. Keith, thank you so much for your insights today, for what you've contributed. I think it's just been excellent to talk these things over. If you're listening in and you'd like, to comment or like or share or, get a part of this discussion, we'd love that. At any rate, Keith, again, thanks for joining us. And everyone who's watching on, thanks for joining us. It's been another great episode. We're going to see you next week. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to the Disciple Standard Podcast. We're so glad you joined us. We encourage you to continue the conversation by joining us on social media. Also, if you want to learn more about the Multiply method or learn about how to take the Multiply pledge, we encourage you to join us on our website at multiply222.com. Have a great day.